Welcome to the third session of Aarhus Symposium 2015. I hope you enjoyed the Arla break. Now let me introduce the moderator for this session. He's editor-in-chief at Børsen, and he's a familiar face here at Aarhus Symposium. He's been here before. We are very glad to welcome him back. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Niels Lunde.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. This is my third time at Aarhus Symposium. I think it's a wonderful arrangement you are having here. And my job today is to be a moderator, and I will start introducing our guest speaker, Lars Frelle Petersen from the Danish Agency of Digitisation. Lars, please have the floor.
We are around 1,200 employees in the Ministry of Finance. I said many of these employees are working in two shared service centers. One state IT who's running PCs and mainly server maintenance for around 12,000 employees in the public sector and in the state, in the ministries. And then we have a shared service center also who's running mainly e-invoicing and salary payment. So what's left is Agency for Modernization, who's mainly also the one who's negotiating the salaries for all public employees, mainly on the state level, but also negotiating sometimes also for the local level. And then we have my agency, who's 180 employees, and then we have the department, which is around 200 employees who are mainly servicing the minister. So I'm part of the Ministry of Finance, and actually with this I'm probably the biggest risk for the Ministry of Finance to lose his job. That's at least what he tells me. So it's important that this is running smoothly on a daily basis, and every time it doesn't, I have to appear on television. I will return to that later on. I will here tell about how we work with digitalization in the public sector. As Eva Bernicke was telling early on, it's a journey, we think, actually, and we are on the way. It's a big effort to change the public sector. We are 800,000 employees. We're doing almost everything. Many of the things have actually nothing with each other to do. So it means that we are actually we're not in a single market, we are in all markets. So it's very difficult to talk about the public sector as a whole. And people are generally saying, why don't you control the public sector much better? But it's very difficult because we have different layers of government. We have municipalities who have their own political elected. We have regions also with their own political elected. And of course we have the parliament, meaning that we have a lot of self-governing in the public sector. In general, we are negotiating the budgets, but we are actually not allowed to interfere in how the municipalities are going their daily businesses, except when they're not upkeeping the law. So in general, we make larger negotiations. You should go this way, we agree on this, and then we hope that the municipalities do so. We try then to give them the right incentives, and that's where the Ministry of Finance normally are in play. We take away their money, and that helps. In general, it's a very good incentive. We maybe have only two main incentives in the public sector: using the money tool or using the law. And of course, being part of the Ministry of Finance, and I think being there with the digitalization agenda, it helps me tremendously that we are part of a bigger machine that is running the whole budget. And that's the main reason also why we are there. We're not there because people in the Ministry of Finance love IT. They don't. Actually, they're quite scared of it, many of them, mainly because it's a risk like this. So it's seen as a tool for transforming the public sector, something that can gain a better budget, a more modernized public sector. And I think that's the main reason why I'm there and still there. I've been there since 2001 in different positions, and am now the head of my own agency. But we're there because we think that the biggest tool for transformation of the public sector in the future will be digitalization. And it will, in many ways, I think, also challenge the way and maybe even disrupt some of the ways that we are organized today. I think we have to change the whole way we do business in the public sector. Think about healthcare. Today, we have doctors and patients who are coming into hospitals. We are building big facilities that we expect our patients to come to be operated. Some of them are of a big burden to the public sector, of course, because they have a disease, unlucky for them, but also something that we, of course, should take care of. But the budget is really much, you can say, burdened by these growing number of chronic patients, like you heard maybe earlier on Lars Frelle Petersen talking about people with different kind of chronic diseases. These kind of patients, we would like to treat them in a total different way. Could we have them stay at their homes? Could we monitor their own diseases back there? Could we keep track of the data of how they treat themselves so that we can organize medicine in a different way, so that they don't meet up in the hospitals that we are actually at the moment are building all over Denmark? Could we then instead keeping them there, working, keeping a job that would be not only satisfied for the chronic patient, but also for the public budget? That's one area. Another area, of course, the way we actually today teach our children. That hasn't changed for more or less 200, 300, 400 years. But that will be disrupted in a few years to come. We don't know when, but we know it will happen. E-learning will be the main tool in many ways to teach our young. How should we transform the public sector to be adaptable to these changes? How can we adapt the things that will happen around us so that we can take these probably and hopefully things that are invented by private sector and bring them into the schools and the universities and transform the way that we teach our young people. We know in many areas and from a lot of studies that we can actually then graduate how we teach the young ones. We can get everybody in a room together sometimes, but we can also have them at their homes. We can teach them in many different ways, and we hope that that will transform the public sector and probably also make it much more efficient. So we see in many ways, and I could talk about a lot of other areas in the public sector that will transform over the years to come. And part of my job is to push this at the agenda, to push the public sector to be aware of that changes, sometimes by persuading them to take this seriously, otherwise, and sometimes force them to it. So we use not only the budget tool as a way to force them or bring them the necessary incentives to change, and we think that one of the things that help us change them is to take their money away. And that's a problem sometimes, because if you take the money away before they have changed, then they lose the incentives. So what is the right moment to take away the money so that they still have the incentives to actually do what they should? Should they keep some of the money in the institutions? They think, many of the institutions and public institutions think that they should stay with their budget and they should grow. They don't have any incentives to be smaller or have less employees. They have a tendency to grow. So how can we control that situation? How can we make other incentives in these institutions so that they will follow and keep track and also adapt to new technologies? Another part is also something that we are quite worried about, our whole way of taxation. Denmark, we will probably, and today we are living with this very, very huge public sector, we have a very high taxation burden. But this will probably change in the future. The way we tax, for instance, cars. With Uber, maybe in the near future, people will stop owning their own cars. That will mean that we actually have a big hole in the public budget because we need that money from the taxation of cars. Otherwise, we should stop providing maybe kindergarten or other services that we offer through the taxation of cars. We see the same at the moment. We have a big problem with how we tax housing. We're building a new system that should be ready by 2017. That gives us every year 40 billion Danish kroners in taxation. How don't we have an efficient system? We will lose 40 billion Danish kroners. That will mean a lot to the public sector and the whole way that we can provide services. So how should we change that? How should we adapt? How should we build that system that will make us possible still to keep these taxation levels and also adapt to the changes that we see in the future where people are starting not to own their own things or share them? That is actually something quite difficult to tax. How should we tax things that are shared? We can't. So that will mean that we in some areas will lose the taxation level, and how should we then adapt and change to that? Some of the things, and Eva mentioned it also earlier on, we have really done big things in the public sector over the last 10, 15 years. Actually, it goes way beyond where I came in. Actually, it goes back to some people back in the 70s who invented the personal registration number. and a way of starting to understand that we have to use ICT to register everything what we have in Denmark. That means today we have the best registers in the world, not only for who we are, but also where we live, what kind of business we are running, which kind of buildings are owned by who, and so on. People are coming from all over the world to study these registers because that's the key to be more efficient. If you know things and you can use these data, you can build more efficient things. We couldn't have built and made ECID without the personal registration numbers in Denmark. And one thing is also interesting, and that's another key point I think for actually the things that we have succeeded in the public sector, is that people generally trust the Danish public sector. You only have to go south of here, 190 kilometers, then you have a country where they don't trust central government. Trust in government is something that is only seen mainly in the Scandinavian countries. And that means that we can actually build this and persuade citizens to take this and use it. And they do. And the satisfaction percentage at the moment is 83%. I think only North Korea can actually compete with that. 83% of our citizens are satisfied with this. That's actually quite well. It's used 1.5 million times a day, 50 million times a month, 2 billion times since we launched it in 2010. Not lost it, but launched it. That's an important difference. And some of the other things here, we have the easy account also that Eva mentioned. We have the citizens portal. It's used more than 30 million times a year. The digital post, we actually made it mandatory, and that's we actually the first country in the world telling our citizens they can only receive mail from the public sector in the digital post. And many of you, probably, you're actually one of the target groups that are most difficult to reach. Mainly because many of you are people who are younger than you actually think that the public sector is something I shouldn't care about. I don't have to read what is coming out of them. Actually, they are something mysteriously. Then actually what we see at the moment, those who don't read the letters that we are mailing are mainly people between 15 and 22. That's the one group that we still are trying to convince to open the digital post. And what we can see actually, and that's something we haven't seen before, we can now actually measure the things that are going on. So we can see how many people are opening a digital post box. And the last 6 months, only 4.2% of all those who are on the digital post haven't opened it, even through that they have received letters. So how can we reach out to them? How can we convince them to do so? And they are mainly the young ones, and then people who we can see in some ways, we can't see it because it's of course anonymous, but we can see in some ways that they are probably foreigners. That's the other biggest group. But what we otherwise see is that the oldest ones, the oldest citizens in Denmark are opening the digital post very, very often, even through that they haven't received anything. So that's quite interesting to see. And the other thing is that we actually now are mailing through this digital post. We have mailed more than 83 million letters since 1st of November 2014. And if you calculate that by what is the porto today on a letter, on a stamp, that's a calculation that it actually means tremendous savings. So we save every time. If today's porto is around 19 kroners, and by 83 million letters, that's an enormous amount of money that we are saving through that services. And at the moment also, when we measured the last time, we measured the satisfaction percentage of the digital post solution in May. That was around 6 months after we have launched it, and was around 75%. So that's quite all right. Other areas that we're working is with healthcare. We have a big effort also together with the regions and municipalities rolling out solutions for chronic patients. We have a goal by 2019 so that we can treat people with some chronic diseases in their homes with these different kind of solutions that we are now establishing together. Also a big effort not only to change how patients are received at the hospitals, but also how hospitals employees are working with chronic patients. So by 2019 that will change. And all this is due to a very, very long tradition to working together, and that's also some quite unique in Denmark. We have a tradition to working together in the public sector. No other place in the world except for citizens countries, so like Singapore, that is only a one-level country and only one level of government. In Denmark, we have 3 levels, but like many other countries, in some areas, like in Germany, they have 4. But we're actually the only place in the world where we can write only one strategy that we agree on. Most other countries can't agree on writing a shared digital strategy, but we can do that in Denmark. We share the strategy together, and we've done so since 2001, starting up with actually establishing the first generation of digital signature and going on from there to what we now are at the end of this strategy period that is actually finished by the year of 2015, where we now have made it mandatory for our citizens to service themselves online. And not only digital post, we have also made by legislation 89 areas of services mandatory for our citizens and for our businesses. Nowhere else in the world is that actually went through Parliament and is done in legislation. And we can see that the citizens in general are satisfied with what we are doing. So also from an international perspective, we in Denmark have a quite unique situation. We actually have on average 2 delegations from outside of Denmark who are coming to Copenhagen to see the things we have established at the moment, because we have actually convinced our citizens to use the services that we offer. That's one of the biggest problems for public sector. People don't use the services that we offer online. But we have by legislation, and it's actually a very friendly legislation, because underneath what we said to people is actually a way of nudging them. We have told our politicians it's actually pushing, a small pushing, not only for the public sector, because the problem was, from our perspective, was that many of the public institutions had very, very poor services online. And they said to us, why should we improve these services? Because nobody is using them. People are coming to the citizen service centers, so why should I change it? So how could we change that maneuver? By saying, okay, if we force all the citizens to do so, then you have to improve your services. So there was a 2-way strategy. We pushed the citizens. At the same time, we told all the citizens, if you don't want to, you can actually get excused. So 11%, we actually had a calculation that we thought that 20% of our citizens would say no, but only 11% have then been excused. So we are in a situation where 89% of our citizens are now on a digital post, and we also reached levels around 80% of our citizens are services themselves online. They can't be excused, they can meet them in the citizen service center and get excused and then get the things sent by letter in traditional form. So it's a nudging form we actually have used, making very, very gentle legislation and ensuring the politicians that we take care of those who can't do this. And it's actually has been, of course, I've received tremendous amount of letters complaining of what we have done, but in general we haven't seen anything going wrong in that process of changing. So that's quite interesting, and that's also the reason why a lot of countries are coming to Denmark at the moment and seeing what we do. And also we see this international perspective as something differently. We also have to see that we compete with other countries. We have to be in attractive countries to establish a business in or move your business to Denmark. So also seen from that perspective, it's very, very important for us to have an efficient public sector who are eager to help these businesses who are coming to Denmark so that it's easy to run a business. How can we do that? How can we understand them? How can we make it very easy that you can, today in Denmark, you can establish a business in a split second? That's not many other countries who are capable of doing so. So that's also a way of cooperating also between the municipalities and the state level so that we ensure that these businesses are situated in Denmark and then they think that the public sector is efficient. So that's also important for us. And then, of course, the other thing is that it's always very nice to be in the forefront of a benchmark. Every time we are slipping down these rows, I get a lot of questions and complaints that we are poor in what we are doing. I have to say today that I've done an enormous amount of benchmarking in the way we do e-government, and I was very happy that Eva chose one where we're in the forefront. Around half of them, we are around place number 30. So it's depending on what you measure and how you look at it. But I think how we're seen in Europe in general, and also by some of our colleagues that we consider to be at the forefront, they think that the things that we have done in Europe and in Denmark over the last 2-3 years is something quite differently than the other ones. But the one thing is that we now made it mandatory for our citizens to use it, and I'm sorry this is in Danish, but what she's saying is there's not enough alcohol in the world to actually like the e-box or the digital post solutions. I think she's right. And I think that's a lot of things to do with how we work in the public sector. We are a monster with a lot of heads. So how can we actually offer services to our citizens where they think that the public sector is united? People expect when they come into the hospitals that you know that the doctor who is sitting in front of you have all the information around you because you have put that to your private doctor, or you have maybe even put it in a form. Why hasn't he received it? He's normally not allowed to. That's the main reason. But otherwise also you can see in a lot of areas there's a lot of papers still running around. We're actually changing that at the moment with one of the biggest ICT projects seen in the public sector in Denmark, where Region Sjælland and Region Hovedstaden is together are building a healthcare platform that will change how we actually provide services at all the hospitals in whole of Sjælland. But otherwise, we can see that we are still very, very far from actually providing the services to our citizens in a correct and a way that they consider to be user-friendly. And that, of course, is a problem because we have these enormous amount of institutions who have different kind of business cases, and many of them saying, okay, now our citizens, and that's actually something now we have seen, is that now the institutions are saying us, why should I improve my service when the citizens are mandatory to use it? Because they're using it, so why should I improve it? It's good enough. So, meaning that they don't want to go on mobile phones, they are very, very slow to adapt to new browser formats and so on, which make a lot of citizens annoyed. And when they call to complain, normally the local office is closed, so they call somebody else to complain. So they are actually treated very, very poor in the public sector. They're calling all over the place. And who's paying for that? Nobody actually is knowing because we are not measuring what is happening. And the local government doesn't do that. Even a state ministry and a state doesn't even keep track of how the citizens are reacting to the services that we offer them. So we have to change that. How can we actually meet our citizens in different ways? And one of the other things is, of course, we also have seen that the one thing we did here, and that's actually a tremendous effort, is we have digitalized the letter. We put it in a PDF format. That's not a big step, but it's a change. Now we know that the next step will be, how will we actually look at a letter in 2025? Will it have the same form? Should it be interactive? Should it be a communication format that maybe we should stop sending letters and just exchange information? That's what we're looking at the moment. How should we change this in the near future? So these are just some of the challenges that we're looking into, that we see that the technology development is disruptive. That's one of the problems for us. We have to keep track and keep speed. And one of the things that the public sector is very poor at is actually speed. We are very, very slowly. We are moving very slowly by the way we adapt technology and how we can implement it and change. We also have a politicians level that are looking into this public sector as a way of funding new things. There's actually no new money in the public sector, so how can we feed them with their own tail? How can we change the way that we provide services, be more efficient, and then use the money that we can free up for new services, or to even exchange and even enlarge our healthcare services? Another part is that we know that we have a lot of ICT scandals, and as Eva was telling earlier on, it's actually quite interesting to see that when you look into the statistics, it's as poor in the private sector as in the public sector. But our biggest problem is, as you have seen with EFI, the EFI scandal in the taxation authorities, is that we don't stop them in time. That's the biggest difference between us and the private sector. We all have the same scandals, but in the private sector they have a tendency to close them down before they're running into what he calls, Ben Flubia is calling black swans. We stop them too late and paying a bigger price by having a bigger scandal at that time. Another part is that we look into data. Data is something that we will be running on in the future. Maybe it's the oil for the public sector in the future. We need data to know more of the reforms we're doing, how are they working. If we can be more wise on how we teach our children, we can improve the services and the way that we teach our children in the future. We know that, and we want to build up how we can work with data in the coming years. Very short on my background, as I promised. Actually, I don't have a very, you can say, a line I've followed all the years. I was educated at Roskilde University. I was actually the first employee from Roskilde University in the Ministry of Finance. I think I probably more or less still am. Oh, I'm not. That's a joke. I was actually, I was taught leadership at Roskilde Festival. I was responsible for that stage you could see in the picture in 3 years, in 1996, 1997, 1998. I was responsible for 500 volunteers who built that stage, had David Bowie on it and many, many others, running it for 4 days, putting it all down again, and then do the same all over 1 year later. Being able to teach people how to work together, making this deadline and making that reaction from 60,000 people is a unique experience. I think you can do that in many ways, not only with Roskilde, but in all kind of forms. I think being taught in different ways to collect that experience and bring it in your work is also for me been of great importance. And I think I do it on my daily basis, not only to work with the employees I'm responsible of, but with the whole of the public sector. How can we convince each other to work together? What can we benefit from this? So I think I can only recommend you that you should try everything before it's too late, because suddenly it's your own responsibility. So if you have practiced before, you're more willingness to take on your role. Yes, I think that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. I have... Skal jeg bruge mikrofonen? Yes, okay. Thank you, Lars, for a very interesting presentation. I think I have got some excellent questions for you from the audience, and I will try to ask as many as possible. I'm sorry. When you reach 50 years, you experience two things. You need glasses, and you have to go to the toilet in the night. Lars, do you ever think about the normative effects of transforming teaching, healthcare, and so on into a digital era, taking away the human contact and interaction?
Yes, but I think my job is first of all to actually challenge that is a problem. I think we should try it, and of course it wouldn't be one way or another. I think we will see a way that our teachers will teach differently. We still need persons. We still need the personal contact. We still need the coach, the one who can maybe challenge us in the way we are taught, I think. But at the same time, I think we should be using these technologies in many, many different ways. And we can see that the spirit from the young ones who are interested in these technologies, if we can adapt to that, we can maybe make these students, teach them faster, learn them more things. I think that we should have, of course, a combination. But one of the things that we were faced was that we had a situation with our teachers in Denmark in general, that they were paid no matter how many hours they used on preparation. Meaning there were no motivation for a single teacher to adopt and try new technologies. It was much more cheap for teachers to stay and do the same thing. We know by nature that means you do the same what you did last year. So one of the things we've done with the reform in how we teach at schools is that we actually now challenge how many hours should a teacher use to prepare themselves, and maybe use more time together with the children. And then by introducing more technologies, we can speed up the preparation time, we can correct many of the things that they maybe fill out and fill in. And at the same time, we can also measure actually when it comes to healthcare, that of course the personal contact is nice, and a lot of the chronic patients of course are happy to come to the hospital, but many of it actually showed us that they're much more happy on being treated at home, because they can keep their job, they can stay with their family, they can actually take care of themselves, they can be with themselves. So in general, we can actually see a win-win situation in many of the things that we are looking into.
But what would be your biggest challenge? Is that to develop new technical solutions, or is it to motivate citizens to embrace solutions?
I think the biggest problem is the public sector. I think that what we see is that the citizens in general are much more in forefront than where we are. Not all of them, but a lot of Danes are. So I think the biggest problem is actually to convince the public sectors to adapt to these technologies, and especially some of the skilled employees we have, teachers, for instance, doctors, nurses. How should they change and how should they adapt? And I think the educational effort to change that for the people who are employed today is, I don't think it's a problem for you, but I think it's a problem for the people who are employed today to go through that change. And I think also our problem is timing. When should we adapt? When is the time for the technology that we should use? Is it good enough? Is it good enough to be used in this healthcare sector? Can it save lives? Because if it doesn't work, it means loss of lives. So I think there's two challenges. That's the adaptation in public sector, and of course the knowledge of when to pick up these technologies.
But I guess timing is also very difficult, because some citizens, like these people here, I'm sure are very ready for any technical intervention. But some people, like me, maybe more slowly. At home, at my place, I got myself a NIM ID now, and it works the way that I get an SMS on my phone saying you have digital post. It may be important, and then I call my wife, and then I say, Karin, I got digital post, and she will say to me, sure, I will look at it tonight. So some of us are not there yet. So I guess timing, when you should put out a solution to the citizens, is very difficult.
Yes, it sure is, and I think we had, when we made the whole strategy around setting the goal that 80% of all communication with the public sector should be digital by the end of 2015. We made a lot of studies into where are the average citizens, and we could calculate, okay, at that time, at least we said 20% weren't capable in 2011 to serve themselves online, and maybe like you. And maybe the number were even a bigger than 20%. But we then calculated and said, okay, if in 4 years' time from this point, it will have changed. And I think we actually then have seen that 89% have then signed up to receive a digital post. If you read it or your wife read it, it's not a problem for me.
Do you sometimes wish you could just force a newly developed system through to the public?
Oh yes. I dream all of that all the time. But of course, we are living in a democracy. Sometimes, of course, I could dream of being like running a big company where everybody is on the same payroll. We are not. And I think one of the things is that, of course, people can then dream of, okay, we then change the system. We have a single responsibility person. But running a machine of 800,000 people with all kind of different tasks is impossible. So of course we have different layers of government, and I think one of the things is good for me because I'm probably an optimist, and I'm also a risk person. So being challenged for risk and timing is good. I think that actually at the end we provide better services. Also that we take care of people who are not there. I would probably overlook them. So with help from my colleagues and also those who should carry, and I think that's one of the main things that we should be clear about. It's not the technology, it's the change of how we do things that's important. And I can't, from where I'm sitting, controlling all 800,000 employees. That is only something a manager very close to them can do.
But when you come out with a new technical solution, how much resistance do you experience from public sector institutions?
A lot, in general. And mainly it depends on how the incentives are running. one thing is if that they can see that there's a local business case in it for them, so that they can see they can benefit from, and I hear in a business case in that sense it's not only money but also that they can benefit in other ways. So if they can see that the benefits are bigger for them if they do so, they are more willing to do so naturally. So what's important for me is not only to convince them that this technology is good and you should use it, but also to be very, very clear that they should pick why these incentives are in the correct sense or are following the same track, so that they actually pick these technologies only by their own will.
Okay. If we are to keep digitalizing the public sector, then how do we keep it safe from hackers who want to shut it down or who want our data?
Anybody that could answer that question would be hired by me. I think that's a very, very good question and a problem for us, not only for us but also for everything what we do in the digital sense. I think we can't stop being more and more digitalized. I think we should in some ways adapt to more ways of how could we split data between, so that it's not everything is collected and stayed in one database. I think we should improve and professionalize the way that we in the public sector are working with data and systems in general. We are in many ways still amateurs. And I think that's the way we should look into it. I'm not necessarily sure that we should go all the way with private data and other ways so that nobody is knowing who is who. But because one of the main things that the way that we are running an efficient public sector is actually that we know exactly who you are. If we stop knowing who you are, then we stop being efficient. So I think we have to find a way into this and to solve it. And I think it's solvable, but it will always be a problem.
At a top 10 of your challenges, what is this challenge? What position would you place it in? Is it one of your biggest challenges?
It definitely is. And I think it's not only to deal with that we have problems that occur from time to time, and I think we will have that, but I think it has to do with keeping trust in the public sector. If we lose trust from our citizens that we can keep their data safe, then they stop trust us, they stop paying taxes or willingness to pay taxes, and then we have a totally different situation. Then we will probably have a more like an American situation where the citizens in general don't trust public sector. And then I could lose my job. I don't think that's a problem in itself, but that will probably change the way that the public sector is running in Denmark. So I think it's at the top 5 of my agenda, definitely.
Okay, do you have a question?
Yeah. Personally, I have a Hotmail account where I get half of my information, and a Facebook account where I get the other part. And sometimes I'm wondering, why couldn't I have all at one place? And I know the answer, because they are like competing private institutions. But you, who is like responsible of all these public institutions, why don't you just merge the systems? So we don't need to have an e-box and SCAT website and all those kinds of different websites that we always need to like figure out the system when we need to use them.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. In the state level we have calculated. Last time we did that was in spring. We have 4,000 different systems. Not all of them are towards our citizens, but in general we are running more or less 4,000 systems. The public sector. Should we try to reduce the number and put it into one? One of the problem is, are we sure we are picking the right one? Is the system that we run centrally good enough? One of the things that we think is that by splitting up the public sector, it's capable of innovating itself in smaller units instead of one big place. And we know also by centralizing everything, our problem will be that it will be very bureaucratic to change. And one of the things I'm scared of is that we are not very good at running public-owned big infrastructure. That's why the reason you see that we are selling a lot of the infrastructure and giving it up to private companies, because we have difficulty of developing it. At the moment we are running a tender on this, a partnership for the future of ECID. And there's two organizations who have now part of a dialogue with us, and should they own this together with us, and that's the financial sector, and that's the pension and insurance companies in Denmark. So in the future we will see that we will probably own some of the infrastructure together with them. We hope actually also that we can stop doing it ourselves and then let the private companies run some of these technologies, because they're probably better at innovating than we are.
I have a question here, and I know you have answered some of it, but I still think it's a very interesting question. Which public area is next to be changed by disruptive technology, and by which tool?
I think what is at the moment is changing most rapidly is probably healthcare. And I think that we have focused especially on the chronic patient, and where we see that the collection of data also in this area is actually providing us with very useful tools to understand how to cure patients better, how to treat chronic patients. So what we agreed on with the municipalities and regions this summer was that we by 2019 will have adopted this solutions for chronic patients by 2019. So that's one of the biggest tools at the moment, the changes in this treatment of chronic patients.
When do you think we will get online voting?
Oh, that's a good question.
It must be one of your dreams.
No. Yeah. It is actually one thing is that it's quite interesting. There's no business case for doing it electronically. It's very cheap to do it on paper, and the problem is that you have to build a system that is only used every 4th year. That's a problem in itself. The other part is that our politicians love the gathering and the paper use of voting. So they hate the idea in general. So every time we actually say, now we should do it, they say, no, I love the idea that everybody is in this room together calculating all these votes who are given up. So I think we will have it in the future, but not in the near future.
Okay, that's a question.
I get worried when you talk about data all the time, because it's only when we have information we can create value. Data itself is...
That's true. And we have actually the public sector today have tremendous amount of data that is not used. Of course, when I talk about the use of data, I think, of course, it's inside the law and how we should allow to exchange these data. But we can see that we can provide services very, very differently by actually reusing the data that the citizens are giving us. We can automate a lot of services today that we don't automate today. We can actually also know when the situation for the citizens are changing. For instance, today the taxation agency is mailing people who are starting to earn money differently from last year, so that the taxation level change. That's an example of how to use data more wisely. I even think, and I could exactly remember it, but I think also with people who are getting grants, student grants from public sector, actually when they change today and earn too much, they actually stopped getting the funds because otherwise they have to pay them back. So we can actually do things before the things are happening. And I think that's some of the things we would love to do more. Of course, we challenge the politicians. Are they allowing us to actually take these data and reuse it as information, as you're saying?
What is your perspective on how digitalization will affect the public employment level?
It's a very political question, and I'm not a politician here. But of course,
I guess
my job is to reduce the number of employees. Otherwise, because the biggest, you could say, the biggest cost in the public sector is the employee. That's the main cost, except for paying out money to the citizens. So I think to reduce the cost by more digitalization, that means the number of employees will be reduced. And I think no matter what, we are in a situation that we have an enormous amount of people who are working in the public sector. But if they were working in the private sector, it would be better for our taxation level. So of course also from the political level, except for some parties, then the most parties are agreeing that it's better to have people in private companies than hired by public sector.
But I guess you are facing a problem, I guess, from the unions on this issue.
Yeah, in some ways, I think also the unions know that the things are changing, and also that their employees should adapt. I think otherwise they will be expendable. What will happen if these employees don't adapt to the future that will come? That we will seek for other employees that are capable of doing it. So, but of course, we see in some labor organizations a higher unwillingness to adapt. In some areas, they are more tough and have more saying than in other areas, without naming them. And of course, that's a challenge because they need to change.
Which limitations do you face on a daily basis in your position in regards to working in the public sector?
I think it's a privilege to work in the public sector, mainly because I get up every morning and think that I'm doing something that matters to people. I'm not paid the same amount of money that other people are in the private companies, but I think I love my job, and I think that's the most important thing. The biggest challenge is, of course, that we are this monster with an enormous amount of heads, and who's actually making the decisions. And of course, the incentives is actually not very often are pointing in the same direction, meaning that a lot of organizations are not working for the common good. They're working on their own survival. And I think that's a problem sometimes, and then very, very ignoring to see institutions working on their own survival instead of being there for their taxpayers and changing the way we do business and be more efficient. And I think that's something you get used to, but it's still ignoring that people are doing that. I think you will see that in many other areas as well.
Who are they?
Mainly the municipalities. No, it depends. I think it depends on what the agenda is. I think you see institutions, for instance, that the question was earlier on, why do we have all the homepages in the public sector? Why on the state level we have around 400 different homepages? 95% of them are very, very simple. It costs us a tremendous amount of money, but we can't agree on actually building it more together. We can't agree that we offer services that is recognizable for the citizens, even though we know that it will be of great satisfaction for our citizens that they can recognize public sector. Today they know, actually we know that from opinion polls when we measure it, that the citizens in general are saying they know they are on a public web page when it looks amateurish. So could we change that? Could we make it more user-friendly? We could, but the single institutions think, no, I love my crown in the top, I love this in the left spot, I would like this over here. And why are they doing this? They only do this for their own fun, not for the citizens. And I think you can find that in all institutions I work with.
What is the next big system like NemID that will be coming to the people in Denmark?
We are at the moment doing the tender for the next generation of ECID. And that's actually a very, very difficult process. And as Eva is saying, if you would love to do big ICT projects, come to my place. We should change that infrastructure. We're going into the big tender, and by 2017, 2018, we should have a new technology in that field. So that's a big problem and a big challenge. Also something of how, when we develop this, it will work for 10 years. So we have to more or less look into the future and see how will the uses of this be by 2026, 2027. That's very, very difficult to imagine today, but we have to.
Maybe you can elaborate a little bit. We have talked about it already, but nevertheless, how do you think that IT and digitalization can influence the effectiveness in the public sector?
I think it already does that today. I think a lot of the things that we've done earlier on, we didn't know how it worked. Today we can measure things, for instance. We can measure reforms, we can measure how the citizens react to things. Early on in the beginning where I came into office in the Ministry of Finance, it was a tendency by us to be part of the decision process. That's mainly where we are active. So doing the big reforms, writing all the papers that the politician can agree on. And then when they made the decisions, then we went on to the next reform. We didn't care if it worked, we cared for the next reform. Today we can actually measure these reforms, how they're working, how they change the surface of working in the public sector and also towards the citizens and the businesses. And I think already there it changed how we do politics. And then of course on a daily basis we can also calculate by saving posts and saving reports from citizens, and we know every time a citizen is actually putting in things online, we save around 150 Danish kroners. If they otherwise would have entered as citizen service centers and done it on paper, it would have cost us 150 kroners. So we can see the savings on a daily basis.
Do you cooperate with other countries who are ahead of Denmark in e-government solutions?
Yes, there's a few countries that I would mainly say our inspirations today is not coming from other countries. Our main inspirations are big businesses, mainly financial sectors where we have a lot of relationships and cooperation together.
What do I learn from them?
Mainly the focus on customers. I think that the problem in the public sector starts with that we can't agree on how to look at our citizens. Are they citizens? Are they patients? Are they clients? Are they customers? In general, they are all these things, but one thing is that in some areas they should be considered customers and be treated like that. And I think we could learn from how financial sectors, travel agencies and others are working and looking at citizens in that way. Then of course we share technologies, we share the ECID infrastructure, a lot of the infrastructure today that we are building, the financial sectors looking and all kind of businesses are looking into these technologies and saying, could we reuse that in the private sector? And I think we have an obligation to make that possible for them. Of course we look to countries who are quite advanced, Singapore, Hong Kong, which is differently, but Hong Kong is also quite interesting. Japan, when it comes to treatment or how they can actually work with an elderly population. They have big problems in Japan, so we actually travel to each other countries to actually learn from each other how to cope with that in the future.
But looking at the citizen as a customer, is that a new mindset in your public sector?
It's a very difficult thing because the first question is if you look them at as customers. Are they always right? Should we be focused on treating them with all kind of offerings, or should we actually be more keen on actually keeping down the tax burden? Because if we provided the service on the same level as private companies, the only way that could be paid for that is by taxation. So there's a level of how to treat citizens as customers.
I think in the private sector you would not say the customer is always right, but you would say you have to understand the customer even better than the customer understands himself. That's the trick. That's the mindset in the private sector on the customer.
I think that's correct, but I think also that one of the problem is that the customer, from a single institution's point of view in the public sector, is that the customer is in contact with you in this area. You look at the public sector like this, but it's different kind of institutions who are in contact with you in a different situation. For instance, if you are going to a hospital, maybe you start by your private doctor, and from there you go to the hospital, then you are treated at the hospital, maybe afterwards you are then should be retrained by the municipality. All these areas, how do they work together? It's from the citizen's perspective a shared public sector that should cooperate. But in general, they don't look at that in that way. So they treat maybe very nicely the citizens here, but then there's no relation for the next meeting or the next meeting. And that's a problem also from the public sector, that we don't look at the customers as a traveling through the public sector. And I think we have to change how we look at that.
Okay. Too much digitalization leads to more Big Brother situation. Are you not afraid of this? No?
Oh yes, I am. I think we have. I think it's a thing that, and actually how we look at it changes over time. In general, we trust in Denmark. We trust the public sector with data in general, that they are doing an efficient task. As I said earlier on, you just have to go to other countries that look it quite oppositely. I think we can only go on collecting these data and reuse the data if we can keep the trust. So I think there's definitely a limit to how much data we should collect, and if we start using it in an incorrect way. But I think my job is to challenge it from time to time and say, maybe if we can do this, we can be more efficient. If we can work with it in a different way, we can also make it even more private, so that we actually don't know who we necessarily are in the other end. So we also look into how we can solve some of these things so that we can upkeep the privacy for our citizens, also by new solutions.
We are running out of time, Lars. This is the last question. You must prepare for a very large question now. What makes you a good leader?
I think that's
Take your time.
I think there's. I think one thing is, of course, my job is, of course, to point where we are going. I have a combination of tasks. One thing is, of course, I have to be the one who's saying we should go this way, point out the strategy and convince institutions to do so. Then, of course, I have to provide these services at the same time and make this work. So my organization is actually consisting of very different talents and people with different skills. I think my main role is to orchestrate this happening in a good way so that these people are getting the best synergies out of working together. And I think that's a privilege to do so and being capable of doing so. And my success is that this is happening, that these talents, people with different skills are working together and that we can solve some of these wicked problems and provide new services.
But you're also a leader in the public sector, which means you have a different role, for example, to me. You are working on a democratic mandate. And how much time do you use thinking about your political responsibility, and you always must remember a democratic mandate for everything you do?
I do that a lot, I have to say. I think you can't play, if you can't find the tune in my job, then you can't fulfill the role as the tune in that sense that my minister in some sense is the key player. I'm not talking to him all the time. So I'm working on a mandate that is very broad. And in that sense, I have to understand where the boundaries are for that role.
You have to navigate in a political
I have to navigate very, very closely. And of course, what we're looking into is that what we are working with the digitalization in general is that it went from being something only the civil servants cared about. Today, it's actually quite political controversial. For instance, should we have more data? Should we reuse them? Should we know more about our citizens? Should we automate a lot more of our services? Is it better to treat the patient at home than in hospitals? So of course, a lot of the areas I touch on are political sensible. And I have to have an understanding of that. And it's also something that many of my employees have to have, because otherwise we do things incorrectly and we are losing our mandate.
Okay, very interesting, Lars. Lars, we are running out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.